The thunderous crack of gunfire echoed through the dusty streets of Fort Davis, Texas. As Wyatt Steele dived behind the upturned water trough, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was 1878, and the small frontier settlement nestled in the Davis Mountains had seen its fair share of violence, but today's shootout with the Rawlins gang had the whole town on edge. His weathered Stetson now bore a fresh bullet hole, a stark reminder of how close death had come calling. "You still breathing over there, Marshal?" called Sam Donovan, the town's aging deputy who had taken cover behind the general store's porch. "Takes more than Rawlins' boys to put me in the ground," Wyatt called back, checking the chambers of his Colt revolver. At 32, he'd spent nearly a decade upholding the law in West Texas, his once youthful face now lined with experience and tanned by relentless sun. "How many you count?" "4, maybe 5, Sam answered. "They're holed up in the saloon now." Wyatt nodded grimly. The Rawlins gang had been terrorizing settlements throughout the territory for months. He tracked them to Fort Davis after they'd robbed a stagecoach carrying the mining payroll from El Paso. 3 men dead, including the driver who'd left behind a widow and 4 children. "They ain't leaving town alive or free," Wyatt said, his voice hardened by resolve. "Send word to Judge Parker we'll be needing the hangman soon." As the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the confrontation into a waiting game, Wyatt's thoughts drifted to the letter folded in his pocket. His sister in Austin was getting married next month, wanting her only living kin present for the ceremony. 8 years a lawman, and what did he have to show for it? A tin star, a room above the jailhouse, and enough scars to map the violent history of the frontier. The standoff lasted until dusk, ending with 2 gang members dead, 3 in custody, and a bullet graze across Wyatt's left shoulder. Doc Harmon stitched him up with whiskey as both anesthetic and payment. "You ought to find a proper profession," the doctor muttered, threading his needle through Wyatt's flesh. "Man your age should have a family by now, not collecting lead." Wyatt grunted, taking another swig from the bottle. "Reckon I missed that trail a long while back, Doc." 3 days later, with the remaining Rawlins boys locked in his jail awaiting transport to the territorial court, Wyatt found himself riding along the western trail out of Fort Davis. Reports had come in of a burning homestead, and as the only law for 50 miles, the responsibility fell to him. The acrid smell of smoke reached him before he crested the hill overlooking the Pearson place. What had once been a modest but well-kept cattle ranch was now a charred skeleton, thin wisps of smoke still rising from the blackened timbers. The family of 4 who'd settled here 2 summers ago lay in the dirt near what remained of their front porch, executed without mercy. Wyatt dismounted, removing his hat in respect as he approached the bodies. Rustlers, most likely. The Pearsons' small herd was nowhere to be seen. He'd have to return with help to bury them properly. That's when he heard a soft whimper coming from the stand of cottonwoods near the creek bed. His hand instinctively moved to his holster as he approached cautiously, years of experience making him wary of traps. Instead, he found a young woman huddled against a tree trunk, her dress torn and dirty, her face smudged with ash and tears. Her auburn hair hung in tangled disarray around shoulders that trembled with each breath. "Madam." Wyatt called softly, keeping his distance so as not to frighten her further. "I'm Marshal Steele from Fort Davis. Are you hurt?" Her eyes, wide with terror, fixed on him. She clutched a cloth bundle to her chest that he initially took for a baby but then realized was merely her gathered possessions. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They killed them all." "The Pearsons?" Wyatt asked, slowly approaching and kneeling before her. "Were you staying with them?" She nodded, fresh tears cutting clean tracks down her dirt-stained face. Tessa Kincaid." "I was traveling to San Antonio. Stagecoach was robbed. The Pearsons found me walking. Took me in 3 days ago." Her voice broke again. "They were kind people." "Miss Kincaid," Wyatt said gently, "I need to get you to town. There's nothing more to be done here and those men might return." When he offered his hand, she hesitated, then reached out with trembling fingers. As she stood, the cloth bundle she'd been clutching fell open, revealing its meager contents: a tattered book, a silver hairbrush, and a small photograph in a wooden frame. "I'm not clean," she whispered, as the cloth fell completely, exposing the dirt and blood that stained her dress and skin. Her voice was heavy with shame and trauma. Wyatt's heart filled with compassion, understanding immediately that her words carried meaning beyond the physical grime of survival. Whatever horrors she'd witnessed or endured in the past days had left marks deeper than those visible to the eye. "None of us out here are, Miss Kincaid," he said softly, removing his duster and draping it around her shoulders. "But that doesn't mean we can't find our way back." He helped her gather her few possessions, then lifted her onto his horse before mounting behind her. As they rode toward Fort Davis, Tessa's exhaustion overcame her fear, and she leaned back against his chest, surrendering to sleep. Wyatt felt a protective instinct rise within him, stronger than he'd experienced in years of law enforcement. By the time they reached town, night had fallen. The doctor's house was dark, so Wyatt brought her to the only other place he could offer his own quarters above the jailhouse. "I'll take the chair," he assured her, lighting the lamp and gesturing to his narrow bed. "In the morning, Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house will have a proper room for you." Tessa stood uncertainly in the center of his sparse room, still wrapped in his coat. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice small. "It's my job, madam." She studied him with eyes that seemed too knowing for her years. "No, Marshall, your job was finding who burned that ranch and killed those people. Taking in a stranger isn't part of a lawman's duty." Wyatt removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. "Maybe I'm just tired of seeing how much harm people can do to one another." He poured water from his pitcher into a basin. "You can clean up here. I'll find you something to eat." When he returned with bread and cold chicken from the hotel kitchen, he found Tessa sitting on the edge of his bed, her face and hands washed, her hair combed back and tied with a ribbon she must have salvaged from her bundle. Without the layer of grime, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 24 or 25, with delicate features and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Thank you," she said, accepting the food with dignity despite her circumstances. Over the following days, Tessa found temporary lodging at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. The town ladies, rallying around the survivor of such tragedy, provided her with clothing and necessities. Wyatt made inquiries about stagecoach passage to San Antonio, but found himself in no hurry to see her departure. Each evening, he found reasons to walk past the boarding house, tipping his hat when she sat on the porch with her mending or reading. Sometimes they would talk carefully at first, then with growing ease. He learned she'd been a schoolteacher in Pennsylvania before deciding to accept a position at a new school in San Antonio. Her parents had passed years earlier, leaving her alone in the world. "What about you, Marshall?" she asked one evening as they walked slowly down Fort Davis's Main Street. "How does a man become the law in a place like this?" Wyatt smiled ruefully. "By failing at everything else first. Tried ranching, mining, even clerking for a spell in Austin. Nothing stuck." He adjusted his hat against the setting sun. "Then the war came. When it ended, I had skills no one needed except men with badges." "The war changed many things," she said quietly. "That it did, Miss Kincaid." A week after bringing Tessa to Fort Davis, Wyatt rode out with a posse tracking the rustlers who'd murdered the Pearson family. They were gone 5 days and returned with 3 men in custody and the grim satisfaction of having buried 2 others in unmarked graves. When they rode back into town, Tessa was waiting on the boardwalk outside the general store. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and for the first time since he'd found her, Wyatt saw something besides fear or sorrow in her gaze, something that made his heart quicken despite his exhaustion. That evening, after the prisoners were secured and his report written for the territorial judge, Wyatt cleaned up and walked to the boarding house. Tessa sat alone on the porch swing, a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Evening, Miss Kincaid," he said, removing his hat. "You came back," she said simply. "I gave my word." She smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed her face. In my experience, Marshall, a man's word and his actions don't always align. Been my experience too, he admitted, leaning against the porch railing. But I try to be the exception. They talked until the stars filled the desert sky, neither mentioning her impending departure for San Antonio. When he finally bid her goodnight, Wyatt felt a curious lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The next morning brought reality back in harsh focus when a telegram arrived from San Antonio. The school that had hired Tessa had filled the position after she failed to arrive as scheduled. She had no job waiting, no destination, and dwindling funds. "I can work," she told Mrs. Henderson over breakfast. "I've taught school, but I can cook, clean, sew whatever's needed." The older woman patted her hand. "Fort Davis could use a teacher, child. Our last one left when those Comanche raids started last spring. The children are running wild as jackrabbits." That afternoon, a meeting was hastily arranged at the town hall. The parents of Fort Davis's 23 school-aged children gathered to meet the stranded teacher who might save their offspring from ignorance. Wyatt stood at the back of the room, watching as Tessa addressed the assembly with quiet confidence. "I can't promise fancy learning," she told them, "but I can teach your children reading, writing, ciphering, and history. They'll know the Constitution and the great works of literature. Most importantly, they'll learn how to think for themselves." Judge Wilson, the town's most prominent citizen, stood up. "What about religious instruction, Miss Kincaid? This is a God-fearing community." Tessa didn't flinch. "I believe education and faith walk hand in hand, sir. One illuminates the world we see, the other the world beyond our sight." Her words satisfied the crowd, and by meeting's end, Fort Davis had hired its new schoolteacher. The town council allocated funds for her salary and the reopening of the small schoolhouse on the eastern edge of town. As the townspeople filed out, offering congratulations and introducing themselves properly, Wyatt remained by the door, hat in hand. When Tessa finally approached, her face was flushed with excitement. "It seems I've found my place after all, Marshall," she said. "Wyatt," he corrected her. "Think we're past formalities, Miss Kincaid." "Then it's Tessa," she replied with a small smile. "I suppose I should thank you if you hadn't found me that day." "Don't think on it," he said quickly, uncomfortable with gratitude for what any decent man would have done. "Town's lucky to have you. Those children, too." Over the following weeks, as summer gave way to autumn, Tessa threw herself into preparing the abandoned schoolhouse. Wyatt found reasons to help fixing broken windows, repairing desks, building a new blackboard. Their time together lengthened, conversations deepening beyond the polite exchanges of new acquaintances. He learned she had a quick wit beneath her reserved exterior. She discovered his unexpected knowledge of literature, gleaned from long nights reading in lonely outposts across the frontier. They debated politics, laughed over town gossip, and slowly revealed the layers of themselves usually kept hidden from others. School began in early October, with 26 students ranging from 6 to 16 years old. Tessa proved herself equal to the challenge of taming the wildest boys and encouraging the shyest girls. Wyatt occasionally rode past during lessons, hearing her clear voice through open windows as she brought the wider world to children who'd never seen beyond the Texas mountains. On a crisp Saturday in late October, Wyatt escorted Tessa to the harvest dance held in the town square. She wore a borrowed dress of deep blue calico, her hair arranged in an elegant knot at her nape. He felt awkward in his seldom-worn suit, but the appreciative look in her eyes when he offered his arm made his discomfort worthwhile. They danced under paper lanterns strung between cottonwood trees, their movements stiff at first, then relaxing as the fiddles played and the town's inhibitions fell away with each passing hour. "You're full of surprises, Marshall Steele," Tessa laughed as he guided her confidently through a lively reel. "Where does a lawman learn to dance? My mother's doing," he admitted. "Said no son of hers would stomp around like a wounded buffalo." The memory brought a smile. "She was a formidable woman. I wish I could have met her." The simple statement hung between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. As the music slowed to a waltz, Wyatt drew her closer, his hand at the small of her back. They moved together with surprising ease, as if they'd been dancing for years rather than hours. "People are watching," Tessa murmured, though she made no effort to increase the distance between them. "Let them," Wyatt replied, suddenly unconcerned with the town's gossip. For the first time in years, something mattered more than his badge or his reputation. As the evening ended and they walked back to the boarding house, their hands found each other in the darkness. No words were spoken, but something fundamental had shifted between them, like the earth settling after a tremor. At her door, Tessa turned to face him. "Thank you for tonight," she said softly. "My pleasure," he replied, acutely aware of her proximity in the shadow of the porch. She hesitated, then rose on tiptoe to press a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Good night, Wyatt." He walked back to his quarters above the jailhouse with the lingering warmth of her lips on his skin and a lightness in his step that hadn't been there in more years than he could remember. November brought cooler temperatures and increasing rumors of Apache unrest in the mountains. Wyatt found himself riding patrol more frequently, checking on outlying ranches and escorting supply wagons. The days he spent in town became precious, especially those when he could find legitimate reasons to visit the schoolhouse. One such afternoon, as the children filed out after lessons, Wyatt leaned in the doorway watching Tessa erase the day's arithmetic from the blackboard. "Impressive work, Miss Kincaid," he said, nodding toward a complex geometric proof still visible in the corner. "That's beyond what most territorial schools teach." She turned, smiling when she saw him. "Thomas Alvarez has a mind for mathematics. I'm giving him extra problems to keep him challenged." She set down the eraser, dusting chalk from her hands. "Did you need something official, or is this a social call?" "Bit of both," he admitted. "Territorial governors sending a circuit judge through next week. I'm to provide security for the court sessions." "That's the official part," she noted, beginning to gather her books. "And the social?" Wyatt stepped fully into the schoolroom, removing his hat. "Weather's turning. Thought you might like to ride up to Sleeping Mountain before the snow comes. View from the summit's something everyone should see at least once." "A picnic?" she asked, her eyes brightening. "If you'd like," he nodded. "Sunday, after church," she agreed readily, and 3 days later they rode out of Fort Davis on a clear, cool morning. Wyatt had borrowed a gentle mare from the livery for Tessa, packed provisions in his saddlebags, and even, to his own amusement, asked Mrs. Henderson's advice on suitable food for the occasion. The trail to Sleeping Mountain wound through pinyon pines and boulder fields, climbing steadily from the valley floor. Tessa proved to be a capable rider, following Wyatt's lead with confidence as they navigated the increasingly rugged terrain. "How far to the top?" she called as they paused to let the horses drink from a clear mountain stream. "Another hour," he replied, refilling their canteens. "Trail gets steeper from here. We can turn back if you're tired," she laughed, the sound echoing among the rocks. "I spent my childhood climbing Pennsylvania hillsides. This isn't my first mountain, Marshall." True to her word, she kept pace as they ascended, occasionally asking him to identify distant landmarks or unusual plants. Her curiosity reminded him how long he'd taken this country for granted, seeing it through jaded eyes rather than with wonder. The summit of Sleeping Mountain was a flat granite expanse offering unobstructed views in all directions. Below them, Fort Davis looked like a child's toy set, while the vast expanse of West Texas stretched to a horizon so distant it seemed to curve with the earth itself. "It's breathtaking," Tessa whispered, turning slowly to take in the panorama. "Like standing at the edge of creation." Wyatt spread a blanket in the shelter of a wind-sculpted boulder and unpacked their meal-cold chicken, cornbread, Mrs. Henderson's apple pie, and a bottle of decent wine he'd splurged on from the hotel's private stock. As they ate, conversation flowed easily between them. Tessa spoke of her childhood in rural Pennsylvania, her father's work as a country doctor, and her mother's insistence that she receive an education equal to any man's. Wyatt shared stories of his own youth in Missouri, his brief time at university before the war erupted, and the aimless years that followed until he found purpose in a badge. "Do you ever think of doing something else?" she asked, watching an eagle soar on thermals far below them. Something besides enforcing the law, Wyatt considered the question, realizing it had been years since he'd allowed himself to contemplate alternatives. Sometimes, there's land west of here, good cattle country. A man with some savings could start a small spread, build something that lasts. Is that what you want, something that lasts? He looked at her then, struck by the earnestness in her gray eyes. Didn't think I did, now I'm not so sure. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the scattered pines. When Tessa shivered slightly, Wyatt moved to sit beside her, offering the warmth of his proximity without presumption. May I ask you something, Tessa? Something personal? She nodded, her shoulder brushing against his. That day at the Pearson place when you said you weren't clean. He hesitated, not wanting to bring pain but needing to understand. You weren't just talking about dirt and ash, were you? Her gaze dropped to her hands, which had tightened into fists in her lap. No, she said softly, I wasn't. Wyatt waited, giving her space to continue or retreat as she chose. When the stagecoach was robbed, she finally said, the men who took our valuables wanted more from the women. There were 3 of us, myself, an older lady traveling to her son's wedding, and a girl no more than 16. Her voice remained steady, though barely above a whisper. They took the girl first, her screams. Tessa closed her eyes briefly. The older woman tried to intervene. They shot her without hesitation. Wyatt felt a cold fury rising within him, but kept his expression neutral, not wanting his anger to silence her. When they came for me, I fought. It only made them laugh. She touched her temple, where a faint scar remained partially hidden by her hairline. One of them hit me with his pistol. Everything went dark. When I woke, my clothes were disturbed. I don't know for certain what happened while I was unconscious, but I felt. She swallowed hard. Violated, unclean, they left me for dead by the roadside. The Pearsons found me walking 2 days later, delirious with fever. Tessa, Wyatt said gently, what happened to you, please? She interrupted, finally meeting his gaze with eyes bright with unshed tears. Don't tell me it wasn't my fault or that I'm not diminished by it. Everyone says such things, thinking they bring comfort. I wouldn't presume to tell you how to feel about your own experience, he said carefully. But I will say this, when I look at you, I see strength, not damage, courage, not shame. A single tear escaped, tracking down her cheek. And when you look at me, does it matter to you? What those men might have done, Wyatt reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if his touch was unwelcome. When she remained still, he gently brushed the tear from her face. The only thing that matters to me is that you survived, that you're here now. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. When she looked at him again, something had shifted in her expression, a burden partially lifted, a door cautiously opened. Thank you, she whispered. They stayed on the mountain until the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the landscape. The ride down was quieter, but the silence between them had transformed from cautious to companionable. When they reached the outskirts of Fort Davis, Tessa surprised him by suggesting they take the longer trail around the town's perimeter, extending their time together. In the weeks that followed, something blossomed between them, tentative yet undeniable. They created rituals. Wednesday evenings at the town's small library, where they took turns reading aloud from Dickens or Twain. Sunday afternoons walking along the creek that meandered behind the schoolhouse, stolen moments on the boarding house porch after Wyatt's evening rounds. As November surrendered to December, their connection deepened. Tessa's nightmares, which had plagued her since the attack, began to recede. Wyatt found himself smiling more, his customary vigilance softening when she was near. The town noticed. Of course, such things couldn't be hidden in a community as small as Fort Davis, but the general sentiment seemed to be approval rather than censure. About time that man found something besides trouble to chase after, Mrs. Henderson remarked to anyone who would listen. Been carrying that badge like it was nailed to his soul. The first snow arrived in mid-December, transforming Fort Davis into a scene from a Christmas card. Children sledded down the gentle slopes behind the church, and holiday preparations occupied the town's women. Tessa threw herself into organizing a Christmas pageant with her students, while Wyatt found himself recruited to build the stable backdrop. "Never thought I'd see the day," Deputy Sam chuckled, watching Wyatt measure boards for the manger scene. Town marshal playing carpenter for a bunch of kids. "Seems I'm full of surprises lately," Wyatt replied good-naturedly, continuing his work. Sam leaned against the doorframe of the half-decorated schoolhouse. "You're sweet on the teacher, whole town knows it. That obvious, is it?" "To everyone except maybe you two," the older man said with a smile. "It's good, Wyatt, she's good for you." The pageant was held on the evening of December 23rd, with nearly every resident of Fort Davis crowded into the town's small church. The children performed with varying degrees of success forgotten lines, improvised additions to the biblical story. One wise man accidentally setting fire to his beard with a candle, but the overall effect was one of joyful community. Afterward, as parents collected exhausted children and the church ladies served cider and cookies, Wyatt found Tessa standing alone near the back of the room, watching the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. "Quite a production, Miss Kincaid," he said, offering her a cup of cider. "The children did you proud." "They were wonderful," she agreed, accepting the drink. "Even Tommy Jenkins, who was determined to include a gunfight in the nativity." Wyatt chuckled. "Boy knows his audience. Nothing says Christmas in Texas like a shootout in Bethlehem." Tessa's laughter joined his, drawing glances from nearby townspeople who smiled indulgently at the pair. When their mirth subsided, she looked up at him with unexpected seriousness. "Would you come to dinner tomorrow, at the boarding house? Mrs. Henderson says I can use the private parlor." "I'd be honored," Wyatt replied, surprised by the formal invitation after weeks of casual companionship. "6 o'clock then," she said with a small smile, "and wear your good suit." The following evening found Wyatt standing on the boarding house porch precisely at 6, freshly shaved and uncomfortably formal in his seldom-worn suit. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string a Christmas gift he'd agonized over selecting. Mrs. Henderson answered his knock, her usual brusque manner softened by evident approval of the occasion. "She's waiting in the parlor," the landlady said, ushering him inside. "Dinner's all laid out. I'll not be disturbing you unless the place catches fire." She paused, fixing him with a stern look. "Mind you behave like a gentleman, Marshal. That girl's been through enough." "Yes, madam," Wyatt agreed solemnly, though he couldn't help a small smile at her protective instinct. The boarding house parlor had been transformed. A small table draped in white linen stood near the crackling fireplace, set with Mrs. Henderson's best china and silver. Candles provided most of the illumination, their warm glow reflecting off crystal glasses. And standing beside the mantel, Tessa waited in a dress of deep burgundy velvet that Wyatt had never seen before. "You look." Words failed him as she turned fully toward him. The dress, clearly borrowed or newly acquired, fit her perfectly, accentuating the grace of her figure without impropriety. Her hair was arranged in soft waves around her face, catching the firelight with auburn highlights. "Thank you," she said, a becoming flush coloring her cheeks. "Mrs. Henderson helped me with the dress. It belonged to her daughter." Wyatt crossed to her, suddenly aware of the package in his hands. "I brought you something, for Christmas." She accepted it with a smile. "May I open it now?" At his nod, she carefully untied the string and unwrapped the paper to reveal a leather-bound volume of Tennyson's poetry. Opening the cover, she found an inscription, "To Tessa, who brought light back to a shadowed place, with admiration, Wyatt." "It's beautiful," she said softly, running her fingers over the embossed leather. "Thank you." "It's not much," he began, but she stopped him with a gentle touch to his arm. "It's perfect," she assured him. "I have something for you too." From a small side table, she retrieved a package similar in size to the one he'd given her. Unwrapping it, Wyatt found a handsome journal bound in dark brown leather, with his initials stamped in gold on the cover. "You once mentioned that you keep track of your cases in old ledger books," Tessa explained. "I thought you might prefer something made for the purpose." "This is too fine for notes about horse thieves and drunken cowboys," Wyatt said, genuinely touched by the thoughtful gift. "Perhaps it's for a different kind of writing altogether." she suggested. Your thoughts, your memories, the stories you carry. Their eyes met over the gifts they held, and something passed between them, an understanding, a possibility, a future not yet spoken but increasingly clear to them both. Dinner was a triumph of Mrs. Henderson's cooking roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and an apple pie that Wyatt declared rivaled his mother's legendary recipe. They talked and laughed with the ease of old friends and the excitement of new possibilities, the barriers between them falling away with each passing hour. As the candles burned low and the fire settled into embers, their conversation turned to the future. Tessa spoke of her hopes for the school, her plans to expand the library, her dream of eventually starting a proper academy that might serve the entire county. "And you?" she asked after describing her vision. "What does Wyatt Steele want from the years ahead?" He considered the question carefully, aware that his answer carried weight beyond the immediate conversation. "For a long time, I didn't think much beyond the next day, the next week. The badge was enough." He looked at her across the table, no longer afraid to let her see the truth in his eyes. "It's not anymore." "What changed?" she asked quietly, though something in her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "I did," he said simply. "Or rather, you changed me. Reminded me there's more to life than keeping the peace and catching outlaws." Tessa's eyes remained steady on his. Such as the possibility of building something, a home, a life." He hesitated, then added softly, "A family." The word hung between them, laden with meaning. Tessa's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. "Wyatt," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to be certain you understand what I told you that day on the mountain, about what happened to me." She drew a deep breath. "There may be consequences, things I might never fully overcome, fears that could remain." He reached across the table, offering his hand palm up. After a moment, she placed hers in it. "Tessa," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I'm not asking for promises or certainties. I'm just asking if you might consider a future that includes me, however that might look." Her eyes searched his face, looking for doubt or reservation and finding none. "I already am," she admitted, "considering it, that is." Wyatt's heart lightened at her words. "Then we'll take each day as it comes, no rushing, no pressure." She smiled then, the tension easing from her shoulders. "I'd like that." They lingered over coffee until the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10. When Wyatt reluctantly rose to leave, Tessa walked with him to the front door. "Thank you for tonight," he said, taking both her hands in his. "Best Christmas I've had in years." "For me as well," she replied, her eyes reflecting the soft light from the hallway lamp. Impulsively, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Tessa. Good night, Wyatt." As he walked back to his quarters through the quiet, snow-covered streets, Wyatt felt a sense of possibility he hadn't experienced since youth. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the future beckoned with promise rather than duty. Christmas Day brought the entire community together for a celebration at the town hall. Tables groaned under the weight of shared dishes, children ran wild with new toys, and even the most reserved citizens succumbed to the holiday spirit. Wyatt and Tessa moved through the festivities, separately he performing his official duties. She helping coordinate activities for her students, but their eyes frequently found each other across the crowded room. Late in the afternoon, as the celebration began to wind down, Judge Wilson called for attention. The elderly jurist, who served as both county judge and mayor, raised a glass in toast. "To our community," he proclaimed. "To old friends and new neighbors who make Fort Davis not just a town, but a home." A chorus of agreement rang out, glasses raised throughout the hall. "And if I may," the judge continued with a twinkle in his eye, "a special recognition for two individuals who have given particular service this year, our Marshal Steele, who has kept the peace with wisdom and restraint, and Miss Kincaid, who has renewed our school with dedication and vision." Caught by surprise, Wyatt and Tessa found themselves the center of attention as the townspeople applauded enthusiastically. Their gazes met across the room, a private moment in the midst of public recognition. The new year arrived with brutal cold and heavy snow that isolated Fort Davis for nearly 2 weeks. When the trails finally cleared enough for travel, the town received its first mail delivery since mid-December, bringing news, letters, and official communications that had accumulated during the storm. Among the items delivered to the marshal's office was a telegram that would alter the course of Wyatt's life. The territorial governor was establishing a new federal marshal's service to cover the expanding Western territories, and Wyatt's name had been put forward as a candidate for senior marshal, a prestigious position that would take him to Santa Fe, hundreds of miles from Fort Davis. He sat at his desk long after Deputy Sam had gone home, the telegram spread before him, weighing the opportunity against what he would lose by accepting it. The position offered advancement, greater authority, and considerably higher pay. A few months earlier, he would have telegraphed his acceptance without hesitation. Now, he folded the paper carefully and placed it in his drawer. This wasn't a decision he could make alone anymore. The following morning, he walked to the schoolhouse before classes began, finding Tessa preparing the day's lessons at her desk. "Wyatt," she said with pleased surprise, rising to greet him. "This is unexpected." He removed his hat, suddenly unsure how to begin. "I need to speak with you about something important. Can we meet later, after your lessons end?" Concern crossed her face. "Is something wrong?" "No," he assured her quickly. "Just a matter I need your perspective on." They arranged to meet at the creek path where they often walked, and Wyatt spent the intervening hours in a state of uncharacteristic indecision. By the time he arrived at their meeting place, he still wasn't certain what he would say. Tessa was already waiting, bundled against the January cold in a heavy cloak. Her face brightened when she saw him, then grew serious as she registered his expression. "Tell me," she said without preamble as they fell into step along the frozen creek. Wyatt explained the offer, laying out the facts plainly, the responsibilities, the opportunity, the distance it would place between them. Tessa listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful. "It sounds like an important position," she said when he finished. "You'd be able to make a real difference across a much larger territory." "Yes," he agreed, "but it would mean leaving Fort Davis." "Leaving?" He hesitated, then committed himself. "Leaving you?" Tessa's steps slowed, then stopped altogether. She turned to face him fully, her breath visible in the cold air between them. "Is that what you want, to leave?" "No," he said without hesitation. "It's not." "Then don't." The simplicity of her response caught him off guard. "It's not that straightforward, Tessa. This kind of opportunity doesn't come along often." "I understand that," she said, her gaze steady on his. "And if you truly felt called to this new position, I would support your decision, but I don't think that's what you want me to say." Wyatt released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "What do I want you to say?" "That you should stay," she replied softly. "That what's growing between us matters more than a promotion, that we deserve the chance to discover what we might become together." Her words crystallized the thoughts he'd been circling for hours. "And if that's what I believe, that this us is more important than any badge or title, then I would say you're beginning to understand what truly matters in life, Marshal Steele." He stepped closer, emboldened by her words. "And what if I told you I'm considering a different future altogether? Not the marshal's office in Santa Fe, not even the badge here in Fort Davis." Surprise registered in her eyes. "What kind of future?" "Remember that land west of here I mentioned? Good cattle country." He held her gaze steadily. "I've been setting aside money for years. Enough to make a start, build something lasting." "A ranch?" she asked, comprehension dawning. "A home," he corrected gently. "A place where a man might put down roots, where a family could thrive." The meaning behind his words was unmistakable. Tessa's eyes widened, her cheeks flushing despite the cold. "Wyatt, I'm not asking for an answer now," he said quickly. "Just telling you what I'm considering, what I hope might be possible someday." She was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I think a man who builds something with his own hands, who creates rather than enforces, who nurtures rather than restrains, such a man would find great satisfaction. and if that man hoped for a partner in such an endeavor. Wyatt asked, his heart beating faster despite his outward calm. Someone to share the building and the creating? Tessa's eyes met his, no longer guarded. I think he would need to ask her properly when the time is right. Joy surged through him, tempered by respect for her cautious response. I can do that, he said, a smile breaking across his face. The February thaw brought renewed activity to Fort Davis. Wyatt declined the territorial position with a carefully worded telegram expressing gratitude for the consideration. Instead, he began making discreet inquiries about available land in the fertile valley 30 miles west of town, consulting with ranchers about cattle prices and building requirements. His relationship with Tessa continued to deepen, their time together increasingly comfortable yet charged with growing affection. They no longer pretended their connection was merely friendship, though they maintained propriety in public. In private moments, hands clasped during walks, lingering embraces when saying goodnight. A stolen kiss in the shadow of the schoolhouse, they explored the boundaries of their evolving relationship with careful respect for Tessa's past trauma. As spring approached, Wyatt made his decision. He arranged to purchase a tract of land 300 acres of promising ranch country with a year-round creek, good grazing, and a sheltered site perfect for a homestead. The current owner, an aging rancher returning east to live with his daughter, accepted Wyatt's offer with the condition that the marshal continue his duties until a replacement could be found. On a mild evening in early March, Wyatt invited Tessa to ride with him to see the property. They set out after school, following the western trail as the afternoon sun bathed the landscape in golden light. How much farther? Tessa asked as they crested a rise overlooking a verdant valley. We're here, Wyatt replied, reining his horse to a stop. This is it. All of this, from that stand of cottonwoods to the ridge line and down to the creek. Tessa gazed at the panorama, her expression one of wonder. It's beautiful, Wyatt, absolutely beautiful. Let me show you where the house would stand, he said, guiding his horse down the gentle slope toward a level area near the creek. They dismounted in a natural clearing sheltered by mature oak trees. A small spring bubbled from rocky ground nearby, creating a brook that meandered toward the larger creek. Wildflowers dotted the grass, their early blooms adding splashes of color to the greenery. The house would face east, Wyatt explained, gesturing with his arm. Morning sun in the kitchen, afternoon shade on the porch. Barn and corrals over there with the windbreak of those pines. As he described his vision, Tessa walked slowly through the clearing, taking in the surroundings with thoughtful attention. When she reached the largest oak, she placed her hand against its trunk, looking up into its spreading branches. Children could climb this tree, she said softly. Hang a swing from that lower branch. Wyatt's heart quickened at her words. He crossed to where she stood, removing his hat as he approached. Tessa, he said, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. I didn't bring you here just to show you land. She turned to face him, her eyes clear and expectant. I know. Taking her hands in his, Wyatt continued, I've lived a solitary life for many years, believing it was the price of the badge I carried. I was wrong. Meeting you showed me how empty that existence had become. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I love you, Tessa Kincaid. I want to build a life with you here on this land. A home, a family, a future. He released her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a ring, a simple gold band set with a modest diamond flanked by 2 smaller sapphires. This was my mother's, he explained, holding it between them. My father gave it to her when they decided to leave Missouri and seek their fortune in the West. He said the diamond represented their love and the sapphires the courage it took to build something new together. Dropping to one knee before her, Wyatt held up the ring. Tessa Kincaid, will you marry me? Will you build this new life with me, whatever challenges we might face? Tears welled in Tessa's eyes, but they were accompanied by a smile that transformed her face with joy. Yes, she whispered, then more strongly, yes, Wyatt, I will marry you. His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. When he stood, she stepped into his embrace naturally, as if they had held each other 1,000 times before. Their kiss was tender at first, then deepening with the promise of their shared future. As the spring sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they sat together beneath the oak tree, planning their life with quiet excitement. Tessa would finish the school term while Wyatt began construction on their home. They would marry in June, after her teaching obligations ended. By fall, the ranch would be established enough for them to begin building their cattle herd. What will we call it? Tessa asked, leaning against his shoulder as they watched the changing light paint the landscape in deepening hues. The ranch, Wyatt considered for a moment, hadn't thought about it. Every proper ranch needs a name, she insisted with a smile, something meaningful. He looked around at the land that would become their home, then at the woman who would share it with him. Redemption, he said finally. Redemption Ranch. Tessa's eyes met his, understanding the layers of meaning in his choice. It's perfect, she said softly. News of their engagement spread quickly through Fort Davis, met with overwhelming approval and genuine happiness. Even Judge Wilson, known for his traditional views, offered his blessing with unexpected warmth. About time you found something worth fighting for besides the law, Steele, the elderly jurist declared, clapping Wyatt on the shoulder. Miss Kincaid will make you a fine wife, Mrs. Henderson appointed herself unofficial coordinator of wedding preparations, recruiting the town's women to ensure the event would be proper and befitting, despite its frontier setting. Tessa accepted their help with gracious appreciation, though she confided to Wyatt that their enthusiastic planning sometimes overwhelmed her. Mrs. Wilson asked if we wanted doves released after the ceremony, she told him one evening, laughing. Where she thinks we'd find doves in West Texas, I cannot imagine. Could release some buzzards instead, Wyatt suggested with a straight face, more authentic to the territory. Their shared laughter was one of many moments that confirmed for both of them the rightness of their decision. As spring progressed, their future took tangible shape. Construction began on their home, a modest but sturdy 6-room house with a wide porch and large windows to catch the prevailing breezes. Wyatt hired 2 experienced ranch hands who would live in the bunkhouse and help establish the cattle operation. Tessa continued teaching, but spent weekends at the ranch site, contributing ideas to the house design and planning the garden she would plant. Her students presented her with a handmade quilt as an early wedding gift, each child having stitched a square representing something they had learned from her. By early June, the house was sufficiently complete for furnishing, though finishing work would continue through the summer. Tessa's teaching term ended on June 15th, with a community celebration honoring her first successful year as Fort Davis's schoolteacher. "Will you return in the fall, Miss Kincaid?" asked 10-year-old Emma Wilson during the festivities. Tessa exchanged a glance with Wyatt before answering. "I will, though perhaps not full-time. Mrs. Reynolds has agreed to assist 3 days a week so that I can attend to my new responsibilities as a rancher's wife." The arrangement had been carefully negotiated to balance Tessa's commitment to education with her desire to be a full partner in building their ranch. The school board, relieved to retain her services in any capacity, had readily agreed to the compromise. Their wedding was scheduled for June 24th, to be held in the town church with a celebration afterward in the community square. As the day approached, Wyatt found himself caught between completing his duties as marshal and preparing for his new life. His replacement had been selected, a capable young lawman from San Antonio named James Cooper, but would not arrive until July 1st. 3 days before the wedding, as Wyatt was conducting his final inventory of equipment and case files for the incoming marshal, a commotion erupted in the street outside his office. Stepping onto the boardwalk, he saw a dust-covered rider dismounting before the doctor's house, shouting for assistance. "Apache raid at the Henderson place," the man gasped, recognizing Wyatt. "3 dead that I saw. They took the women and children." Cold dread settled in Wyatt's stomach. The Henderson Ranch, no relation to their landlady, lay 15 miles northeast of Fort Davis, dangerously close to their own property. "How many raiders?" he demanded, already calculating response options. "Dozen, maybe more," the rider replied, accepting a water canteen from a bystander. "I was checking line cabins, saw the smoke, got close enough to see what happened, then rode for help." Wyatt turned to his deputy, who had emerged from the office behind him. "Sam, get word to Captain Reynolds at the fort. Request immediate cavalry support. Then round up every able man with a rifle. We ride in 30 minutes." As a crowd gathered, drawn by the commotion, Wyatt caught sight of Tessa pushing through to reach him. The concern in her eyes mirrored his own fear, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "What will you do?" "My job," he answered simply. One last time, she nodded, understanding the necessity despite the timing. "Be careful," she said, touching his arm briefly. "Come back to me, always," he promised. Within the hour, Wyatt led a posse of 23 men out of Fort Davis, riding hard toward the Henderson Ranch. Captain Reynolds had dispatched a cavalry detachment that would approach from the east, potentially trapping the Apache band between them. They reached the burning ranch house by mid-afternoon. The scene confirmed their worst fears, the main house and barn destroyed, 3 men dead in the yard, signs of women and children taken captive. The raiders' trail led north, toward the more rugged country where pursuit would be difficult. "They've got about 4 hours on us," Wyatt told the assembled men. "We push hard, we might catch them before they reach the mountains." The pursuit continued through the afternoon and into dusk, the trail relatively easy to follow in the soft ground left by recent spring rains. As darkness fell, they spotted the glow of campfires in a sheltered canyon ahead. Leaving their horses with 4 men as guards, Wyatt led the remaining posse members in a careful approach on foot. From a rocky outcrop overlooking the Apache camp, they assessed the situation. "I count 14 warriors," Sam whispered, "plus the captives, 5 women, 3 children." Wyatt studied the layout of the camp, noting the positioning of guards and the location of the prisoners. "We wait for the cavalry," he decided. "Too risky otherwise." The hours passed with agonizing slowness as they maintained their vigil. Shortly after midnight, one of their scouts returned with news that the cavalry detachment was less than an hour away. "We coordinate with the soldiers," Wyatt instructed his men. "Captain Reynolds knows these Apache. Might be able to negotiate rather than fight." When the cavalry arrived, their commander confirmed Wyatt's assessment. "That's Black Horse's band," Captain Reynolds said after viewing the camp. "He's reasonable for an Apache, might trade the captives if we make it worth his while." "And if he won't trade?" Wyatt asked. The captain's expression hardened. "Then we do what we must." Dawn was approaching when Reynolds sent his interpreter forward under a flag of truce. The negotiations lasted nearly 2 hours, with moments of tension that threatened to erupt into violence. Finally, an agreement was reached. The captives would be released in exchange for 20 horses, ammunition, and food supplies. "Highway robbery," one of the posse members muttered as the terms were related. "Cheaper than coffins," Wyatt replied grimly. By mid-morning, the exchange was complete. The captives, terrified but physically unharmed, were escorted back to Fort Davis, while the Apache band departed northward with their payment, maintaining a wary distance from the cavalry troops. Wyatt returned to town exhausted but relieved at the bloodless resolution. Tessa was waiting at the marshal's office, dark circles beneath her eyes testifying to her sleepless night of worry. "Everyone's safe," he told her, accepting her embrace despite his trail-worn condition. "No more casualties." She held him tightly, her relief palpable. "I was so afraid," she admitted. With the wedding so close, it seemed like tempting fate. Wyatt understood her meaning all too well. In the unpredictable frontier, happiness often seemed fragile, fortune capricious. "Just one more reason to cherish every day we have," he said softly. The incident cast a momentary shadow over the wedding preparations. But as June 24th dawned clear and bright, the mood throughout Fort Davis was one of celebration. The church had been decorated with wildflowers gathered by Tessa's students, and every resident who could walk or ride had turned out for the occasion. Wyatt stood at the altar in a new suit ordered from San Antonio, his badge conspicuously absent for the first time in nearly a decade. Beside him, Sam served as best man, unusually dignified in his own formal attire. "Nervous?" Sam asked quietly as they waited for the ceremony to begin. "No," Wyatt replied truthfully. "For once, I'm absolutely certain about what I'm doing." The small church organ began to play, and the assembled guests rose as one. Tessa appeared in the doorway, radiant in a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Henderson had insisted on ordering from a dressmaker in El Paso. Judge Wilson escorted her down the aisle, having offered to give her away in the absence of her own father. As she reached him, Wyatt felt a surge of emotion that threatened his composure. The woman before him, strong, compassionate, resilient, had transformed his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of traditional words and meaningful promises. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Wyatt kissed his bride with a tenderness that belied the strength of his feelings. The cheers and applause that erupted from their friends and neighbors seemed distant compared to the connection they shared in that moment. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. The entire town square had been transformed with tables, lanterns, and a wooden platform for dancing. Food and drink flowed freely, music filled the air, and even the most reserved citizens joined in the festivities. As sunset painted the western sky in brilliant hues, Wyatt and Tessa slipped away from the celebration. A carriage waited to take them to their new home, not the traditional hotel room, but the ranch house that represented their future together. They arrived at Redemption Ranch as twilight deepened into night. Wyatt lifted Tessa from the carriage and carried her across the threshold of their home, setting her gently on her feet in the front room that still smelled of fresh cut wood and new paint. "Welcome home, Mrs. Steele," he said softly. Tessa's eyes shone in the lamplight as she looked around the house they had planned together. "Our home," she whispered. "It hardly seems real." "Very real," he assured her, taking her hands in his. "And just the beginning." That night, with gentle patience and unwavering respect, Wyatt showed Tessa that the trauma of her past need not define their future. Her trust in him, built carefully over months of growing closeness, allowed her to embrace their physical union without fear. What might have been difficult became, instead, a natural extension of their deep emotional connection, a communion of souls as much as bodies. As they lay together in the stillness afterward, Tessa rested her head on Wyatt's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "I never thought I could feel this way again," she confessed. "Safe, whole." Wyatt's arms tightened around her. "You've always been whole, Tessa, always strong. I just had the privilege of reminding you." Summer flowed into fall, and Redemption Ranch began to take shape as a working cattle operation. Wyatt proved as adept at ranching as he had been at law enforcement, applying the same methodical approach and attention to detail. Tessa divided her time between teaching and establishing their household, finding unexpected satisfaction in the rhythm of ranch life. Their former landlady, Mrs. Henderson, became a frequent visitor, unofficially adopting them as the family she had lost years earlier. Judge Wilson offered legal advice on water rights and grazing permits, while Sam, still deputy under the new marshal, brought news from town during his regular rides out to the ranch. In October, as they celebrated 4 months of marriage with a private dinner on their front porch, Tessa shared news that would change their lives once again. "I've been to see Doc Harmon," she said, her eyes meeting Wyatt's over candlelight. "He confirms what I've suspected for a few weeks now." Wyatt set down his fork, his full attention on his wife's face. "Tessa," she smiled, a mixture of joy and wonder in her expression, "we're going to have a baby, next spring." For a moment, Wyatt couldn't speak, overcome by emotions he hadn't known he could feel. Then he was on his knees beside her chair, gathering her in his arms with gentle reverence. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our child." "Are you happy?" she asked, though his reaction had already answered her question. "More than I ever thought possible," he assured her, drawing back to look into her eyes. You've given me everything I never knew I wanted, Tessa. A home, a purpose beyond the badge, and now a family. The months that followed were filled with preparations, both practical and emotional. The small bedroom adjacent to theirs was transformed into a nursery, with a cradle crafted by Wyatt's own hands. Tessa continued teaching through the winter, but agreed to take a longer break after the birth than she had initially planned. News of the impending arrival spread through Fort Davis, bringing a steady stream of visitors bearing gifts and advice. Mrs. Henderson appointed herself unofficial midwife and guardian of Tessa's health, monitoring her diet and rest with maternal vigilance. As spring approached and Tessa's condition became more pronounced, Wyatt found himself increasingly protective, though he tried to respect her independence. He hired additional help for the ranch, delegating tasks he had previously handled himself to ensure he could be near home more often. "I'm not made of porcelain," Tessa reminded him one evening as he insisted on carrying water for her bath. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not my baby," he replied with a smile that softened his concern. "Not my wife." She relented, understanding that his protectiveness stemmed from love rather than doubt of her capabilities. In truth, she found his attentiveness touching, so different from the stoic lawman she had first met. Their son was born on a clear April morning in 1880, arriving with a lusty cry that echoed through the ranch house. Mrs. Henderson and Doc Harmon attended the birth, with Wyatt pacing the front porch until the doctor finally called him inside. "You have a fine boy, Mr. Steele," the doctor announced. "Healthy lungs on that one." Entering their bedroom, Wyatt found Tessa propped against pillows, tired but radiant, cradling a small bundle against her breast. She looked up as he approached, her smile illuminating the room more brightly than the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Wyatt sat carefully on the edge of the bed, overcome with awe as Tessa placed the newborn in his arms. The infant's face, still red and somewhat wrinkled from birth, nevertheless showed hints of features that would one day resemble his father's. "He's perfect," Wyatt whispered, gently touching the tiny hand that emerged from the blanket. "Absolutely perfect. What shall we name him?" Tessa asked. They had discussed possibilities but made no final decision, wanting to meet their child first. Wyatt studied the small face, feeling a connection that transcended blood and bone, a continuation of himself, yet an entirely new beginning. "Daniel," he suggested. "It means God is my judge, a good name for a boy who will grow up free of badges and guns." "Daniel Wyatt Steele," Tessa agreed, reaching out to touch both her husband and son. "A strong name for a future we'll build together." As spring bloomed across the land, Redemption Ranch flourished. The cattle herd grew, the house expanded with a new wing, and young Daniel thrived under his parents' devoted care. Tessa returned to teaching part-time when their son was 6 months old, bringing him with her to the schoolhouse 3 days each week. Wyatt found in fatherhood a purpose that surpassed anything he had known as a lawman. The small milestones, Daniel's first smile, his attempts to crawl, his fascination with the world around him brought joy that made the hardships of ranch life seem inconsequential. On a warm evening in late summer, as they sat together on the front porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues, Tessa leaned against Wyatt's shoulder with a contented sigh. "You ever miss it?" she asked. "The badge, the responsibility, the respect it commanded." Wyatt considered the question honestly, his gaze moving from the peaceful landscape to his son sleeping in Tessa's arms, then to his wife's face still as beautiful to him as the day he had found her, frightened and alone, by the creek bed. "Not for a moment," he answered truthfully. "What I have now is worth more than any badge or title," Tessa smiled, understanding the journey that had brought them to this place of belonging. "When you found me that day, when I told you I wasn't clean, you were always clean where it mattered," he interrupted gently. "In your heart, your courage, your spirit." "I know that now," she said, her eyes holding his with the steady confidence she had gained, "because you helped me see it." As darkness settled over Redemption Ranch, the stars emerged in the vast Texas sky, countless points of light, illuminating the world below. Wyatt Steele, once a solitary lawman defined by his badge, now husband and father, builder of a home and legacy, looked up at that infinite expanse and felt, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, truly at peace. The journey from who they had been to who they had become had not been easy or straightforward. There had been wounds to heal, fears to overcome, trust to rebuild. But in finding each other, Wyatt and Tessa had discovered a truth as old as the frontier itself, that compassion could transform lives, that love could redeem even the most wounded souls, and that the greatest adventures often begin with the simplest of human connections. In the years that followed, Redemption Ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful cattle operations in the Davis Mountains. Wyatt and Tessa welcomed 2 more children, a daughter named Elizabeth after Wyatt's mother, and another son they called James. Their home became known throughout the county as a place of warmth and hospitality, where travelers found welcome and neighbors gathered to celebrate life's milestones. Tessa eventually established the academy she had dreamed of, a proper school that served children from throughout the county, with a small library named in honor of the Pearson family. Wyatt, while primarily a rancher, occasionally assisted the local law when particular situations called for his experience, though he never again wore a badge. Their love, kindled in the aftermath of tragedy and nurtured through shared purpose, remained the foundation upon which they built their lives. Each day brought its own challenges and rewards, but they faced them together, their commitment to one another only strengthening with time. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work complete, they often sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the land they had claimed as their own. In those peaceful moments, they remembered the long path that had brought them together from a burned homestead where a frightened woman had whispered of her perceived uncleanliness, to a life rich with meaning and purpose. In the end, it was compassion that had saved them, both his for her wounded spirit, hers for his solitary existence. And in that compassion, they had found not just healing, but a love that would endure through all the seasons of their lives.